Good morning. My name is Sarah Woolner, and I work for Zephyr Conferences, who puts on the International Food Bloggers Conference. A little about Zephyr. Little feedback. I don't know if anyone else is hearing that. There's only 4 of us in the office, and we run 5 conferences all over the US and the world. They're in different industries: food, wine, beer. The IFBC specifically started in 2009 and was the first food blogger conference in the world. What's unique about us is we travel from location to location. Obviously, this is a little different because we're virtual, but we're hoping to keep traveling in the future. So if you want to check us out, please do. All the information's on our website. This is my first job out of college, actually, and I feel so incredibly lucky to put on events and be in the food community working with all of you. So I really appreciate it. I do all the marketing for IFBC, so if you tag, tweet, or post, I'm the one seeing it. I see some of you have found the comment section on the right. Feel free to keep chatting away during the session. If you have a specific question for Francis, I ask that you use the Ask a Question little button at the bottom middle-ish of your screen. That way nothing gets lost in the comments, and I can filter through all the questions and then ask them or give them to Doug to ask at the end. So we have a fantastic session for you. This is our keynote featured Q&A with Francis Lam. Francis Lam is the host of the Splendid Table on American Public Radio and is editor-at-large at Clarkson Potter. He has written for many different columns, including the New York Times. He's been a regular judge on the Bravo Top Chef Masters, published writer in Gourmet, Bon Appetit, Food and Wine, and many, many other publications. So it's my pleasure to introduce Francis Lam and Doug, who has been a longtime IFBC supporter, alumni, and board member. So take it away.
Good morning. Thank you so
morning,
much,
everyone.
Sarah, and thank you everybody for joining us. Francis, it is a delight to have you here. We had a lot of fun last week when we had our first face-to-face conversation. And neither of us can remember when we first interacted, but we know it was a long time ago because I've been a fan of your work for as long as I can remember.
Super nice.
I want to make sure we use this time well because there's so much that you know about and can share with us. I want to give you as much time as we can possibly squeeze in. Can you just start off by telling us, how did you get where you are? Because you've got what to me seems like the dream job. You host an amazing podcast, you edit cookbooks, you work with some of the best writers in the world. How do you do that? How did you get there?
Yeah, well, well, literally how I got to where I am is there was this global pandemic, and I ran for my life with my family, and now I am in this wood cabin, as you see behind me. But I don't think that's exactly what you're talking about, and I have mixed feelings about where I am physically anyway. But yeah, so it's sort of funny because the way I've told the story of the origin story of my career, such as it is, I've always started by saying, it's pure dumb luck. And in a lot of ways, it was pure dumb luck. I mean, basically, the short story is I was in culinary school. I had gone to college, and then for a couple of years was thinking about, I went to college, and then after that, I was working in community development and social justice at a local nonprofit in New York City, and really was committed to that work. But also there was a part of my brain that was like, boy, I really miss cooking. And cooking was the thing I had done in college, like sort of, to pay the bills and to pay the rent and all that stuff. And cooking and working in food service and working as a server and all these other like food service related jobs. And I just missed the feeling of camaraderie and the feeling of intensity of the moment. And I missed working with my hands. I've never been good with anything in my hands. Clumsy. I was a bad athlete. Like I was never good at anything that required like skilled use of the body. And, you know, I was like writing grant proposals in an office for like causes I really cared about, but missed this. And so I thought, man, maybe I want to go to culinary school. And I didn't have a sense that I wanted to go to culinary school to be a chef. This was like in the early 2000s. 2002 is when I started the program. But I've been thinking about this for a couple of years. And, you know, I didn't think I wanted to be a chef, but I knew that I loved food and I wanted to study food and I wanted to learn about food, and maybe one day I'd even write about it, you know, like pipe dream, but like not really sure of what I would do with these skills. But I knew that I thought about going to grad school. I thought about doing an anthropology program with like a focus on foodways, or you know, NYU has had their food studies program for many years. It wasn't quite as developed then as it is now. But as I thought about this thing, I realized, A, again, I would miss working with the hands, and B, it seemed to me that whatever I would learn about food, if I were to think about it in any sort of serious professional way, I would want that work to be informed by knowledge of the labor of it, right? The knowledge of the work of it. Again, I keep going back to my hands, but thinking about the hands of the people who make the food that I don't know about. Again, this is in the early 2000s, excuse me. This is in the early 2000s. So Kitchen Confidential had, you know, was still riding high in the bestseller list. And, you know, I read that book like many other people and was like, oh, wow, like the intensity of the story and the sexiness of it. And, you know, now looking back on it 20 years later, as Tony Bourdain did himself, like thinking like, oh, how like totally screwed up that world was that he was glamorizing and valorizing. But at the time, it just felt like, you know, I felt like a little boy reading comic books. Like, wow, it was crazy. And we were in, you know, pretty full on in like the celebrity chef moment, right? Where there were the beginnings of the celebrity chef moment. And I was excited by that, but I also kept thinking, well, what about all the people we don't know about? What about all the people who work for these chefs that we don't know about? Who Tony did write about in Kitchen Confidential too, like his line cooks at Leal and things like that. And he made a point of talking about how, you know, these people were masters and, you know, you don't know their names. And that was sort of prescient, because to this day, we still think of the restaurant industry as being all centered on the world of the chef and not centered on the world of everyone else who makes that world possible. Anyway, so this is, so I thought that if I wanted to do anything with food, I wanted to know what it was like to be more in those shoes than in the shoes of the person whose name was on the menu. So I went to cooking school, and while I was there, I was just so excited about being there. I started writing these emails to friends and family about what I was learning and what life was like in culinary school. And oh my God, did you know there are only 3 ways to fillet a fish? And if you learn the 3 ways to fillet a fish, you can fillet any fish in the ocean. Like, it's amazing. I was going home. This was 2002. So like blogging was just starting. I had never heard of blogs. And this was like sort of like a dial-up connection proto blog, because I was like on my yahoo.com email account and just like emailing my friends and family stories about what I was learning. And eventually one day I got a phone call, actual landline phone call, from an editor at the Financial Times who said, hey, you know, a friend of yours works 3 desks away from me. She's been getting these emails from you. She's been forwarding them to me. They're a lot of fun. Would you like to write for us? And that was my beginning as a writer. And so I say it was pure dumb luck, because in so many ways I feel like it was. So as I started writing for BFT, I wrote a few stories for them, ended up going to a conference where I met Ruth Reichel, who was the editor of Gourmet at the time, and totally fanboyed around her and made a complete ass of myself. Like, truly, like, we don't have time for it here, but like one day, like in person, I'll tell you the story of how I met Ruth Reichel, and is utterly bone-chillingly mortifying. What a complete jackass I was. But funny enough, I was texting with her this morning. So like, she's like a dear friend and mentor now, but I was like, and eventually started writing for Gourmet until the magazine closed in 2009. But at that point, I had built this little career for myself and start growing from there. So I want to go back to this point of pure dumb luck, though, because I've mentioned it a few times, and that's how I've always thought about it. Because, you know, much of it was fortuitous. But in the last number of years, the more I've told this story and the more I think about that phrase, the more I think that phrase does not do justice to the situation. In that there's no such thing as luck, right? And there's this cliche of like, well, luck is the culmination of hard work. What I've realized is luck is the result of privilege, right? And it is entirely a function of the privilege that I was able to go to college in the first place, be from a family that could afford to send me to college, and then decide several years after college that I wanted to go take on the debt of going to full-time culinary school for 2 years, and and be in a place where I met people in college who are of like the kind of social economic class that will allow them to go work at elite newspapers right out of school. So I just want to say that because that is the kind of thing that I think more like is becoming closer and closer to the center of our sort of public discourse around food, which I think is important and great, but it's something that it also still ties back to what drew me to culinary school, what drew me to the first, sort of like the kickstart of my career to begin with, which was, an interest. Interest sounds so like, distanced and removed and anthropological. I don't even mean that, but just like caring about, if we care about food and we talk about how we care about food and we love food and we love the food world, it's like what we need to be talking about is how much we love, well, the earth that produces it, and the people who work for it, the people who work the kitchens who produce it. And, so many of those people are, I have to compartmentalize and not even think about it at this point because it's like, it's so entirely crushing and heartbreaking. How those people are absolutely disposed of in our society. I was talking to a friend of mine, works a very high power job and related to COVID planning and stuff like that. And he was on the phone with, I probably shouldn't say who this person was, but a very, like important official in Florida, dealing with, COVID in that state. And they're talking about the spike of cases in Florida. And they're saying, well, this whole story of like, oh, the spike in cases only because we're doing more testing now. It's like, okay, had a lot of time to do some testing, but okay, we're starting to do testing and now we're seeing the results. Okay, sure. And basically he was saying, well, it's like, well, he was kind of like explaining away by saying, well, we're doing really targeted testing. So we're like, making sure that the people we think will have COVID, we're testing there. So, the returns are higher on those tests. The positive results are higher on those tests. And he said, like we're testing a lot on farms. And I guess that's all I have to say. Yeah, the people who are growing the food, they're the people who have COVID. Sorry, Doug, I think you're on mute. And I'm sorry to have gone on like a 10-minute monologue, but
it's probably good that I was on mute. Thank you for catching that. You make a really important point, and I don't want to get too far into COVID because that's the world that I'm living in with the work that I'm doing these days. But the inequity is so apparent, and many of the people that who are shouldering the COVID burden have also shouldered the burden of getting our food to market,
right,
prepping it and making it in many of the best kitchens. And we don't routinely give them credit. And that's one of the things that makes a lot of the work that you've done over the years so interesting to me. Your passion comes through every word that you choose. And not everybody who writes about food is able to combine the knowledge of the craft with the storytelling piece. So, I mean, it sounds like you've always loved writing. How did you develop your
I actually
style?
absolutely hate writing, but
Do you really?
Oh my God, it's the worst. Why does anyone like it? You like sit in front of a computer and just like this.
But Okay, all right. So I need to push on this, because when I read what you write or hear you on the Splendid Table, your words are carefully selected. You know, you're not just randomly talking, I don't think. If you are, then you're really talented. I mean, you are, but I mean, you have the right words that convey not just the technique or not just the biography, but you bring us into the hearts and minds of the people you're talking about, or the cuisine that you're talking about. You've developed that over time, obviously.
Sure.
Maybe a way to do this is, when you're working with one of the writers that you're working with in your editing roles, how do you guide them to tell better stories?
It's a great question, and it's hard. I don't know that I have like a. That's a really good question. I probably should think about that in terms of, oh, if I were to articulate, like an overall set of guidelines or something like that as to how one might tell stories. I think that would probably be like a really good exercise. I don't know that I've done that, so I don't know that I can say. Well, point blank, I always tell you to look for A, B, and C, or at least if I have, I can't think of it right now. But I guess what I would say is this, and I think it comes through pretty naturally in the way I talk about things, because I think it's really core to how I think about things, and it's sort of just a repackaging of what I said a minute ago, which is there is a phrase that I have used in like classes I've taught and stuff like that, which is oftentimes one of the things I see happening in food writing that sort of ends up putting a limit or a ceiling on a particular piece, and that is people want to write about a thing because they love the thing, they love the food, they love this dish, they love this whatever, they love this Hasselback potato or whatever. And what I often find myself saying to folks is, a thing is never a story, right? And if you go back to your 8th grade writing class, what do you need for a story? You need characters, you need action, and you need, most importantly, you need tension. You need some kind of tension. You need two people or two forces that want different things. And the story is how those things interact with one another and who gets what. And so a Hasselback potato is a wonderful thing, but a thing is never the story. So the question you have to ask is, where is the tension that thing embodies? Where, and for some people it's in the difficulty of making it. So maybe that's the journey, like not knowing how to make it to learning how to make it. For some people it's, well, where does the potato come from historically? For some people is, who invented this dish, and why were they inventing it? What situation were they in when they needed to invent it, and so on and so forth. And for I think for me, probably I would gravitate towards who made it, or who grew it, and why. Like, why did they do that? Why did they have to do that? So I mean, it's sort of a dopey example to just whip out there, but yeah, I guess what I would say is that I'm always asking myself, what is the tension here? What are the hopes of the characters involved in the story? What are their desires? What is their motivation? And how does that, and in telling a story that will connect to people, like, how does what they do connect or speak to or illuminate how the life you want to live as a reader, the life I want to live? A lot of my work is centered on immigrants, or traditionally has been, like in a lot of my writing work, especially has been centered on immigrants. And I know full well it's because I come from an immigrant family, and I think a lot about how my parents made their way in the world and the sacrifices they made to come to this country, because of like the abstract promise of like, oh, you can go there and work hard and make a better life, and how they realized that for themselves and for their family, and how I am the recipient of the privilege that they've like built for me, and how so many other people and families and children come for that same exact reason, with the hope that their kids can have the opportunities that I had. And how, phrase it however you want, more delicately or more bluntly, that doesn't pan out for everyone the same way, or the dream was a lie, or, you know, it was bait to get people here and to take advantage of them, or, you know, and obviously many situations differ and many stories differ, and that's part of what it means to be a writer, is to recognize that there are millions of stories out there. Every person you see on this, well, we don't see people on the street anymore that much, but any person you might see on the street has a whole lifetime of stories within them, right? So it's our duty to help people tell their stories.
What kinds of changes have you seen in the kinds of submissions that cross your desk, or the stories that are considered for the Splendid Table, or any of the other activities you're doing? How are things changing? You know, the Me Too movement obviously influenced things. Now we've got a lot more attention on other injustices. Is that coming through in the kinds of stories and future cookbooks that we'll be seeing?
It should, and in a lot of ways, I say it has to. I would say, purely from my perspective, sitting at a desk in a, let me speak to this from my editor perspective, as an editor at a cookbook publisher. Purely from that perspective, sitting at my desk, there are lots of ways an editor can acquire books or identify authors and in the process of working with an author. One of the main traditional ways is reactive, where agents will come to you with their clients that they've, you know, maybe walked through a proposal process and mentored through a proposal process, and, you know, they've selected you as an editor who might be interested in this project, and so they've sent it to you, and so on and so forth. You see that some, you see that there are maybe some, there isn't, you see the strained, painful faces I'm making. There is an uptick in proposals by people of color, or by people who are from a diversity of identities, who, you know, many of which their work is based on their identity, but what I'd love to see even more of is work that's, well, I'm complaining too many things at once here. I would say there is a little bit of an uptick in proposals by people of color, or people from, you know, again, many different identities, and I think that is for the good. Where I think there are still a lot of problems is the system still involves lots of gatekeepers. The agent is one, the editor is one, the publisher is one, the whole machinery of publishing, and then once the book is published, the media who would cover the book, the media who would, you know, so on and so forth. A lot of gatekeepers, and every layer of gatekeeping means another layer of implicit bias, another layer of, and implicit bias is an important thing to think about, right? Because the whole point is, you know, unconscious. I don't think not that many people are sitting there saying, well, I'm not going to cover this because that person is black or brown, you know, or that person is gay. And, you know, there aren't that many people who say that out loud, or even say that to themselves, but there are just lots of, I don't know, it's like, I get it's kind of a good book, but there's something about it I can't put my finger on. And, you know, once you have, I can't put my finger on, it's like, okay, you got to slow down and really think about what you're thinking about right now, right? But anyway, I guess my point is the whole system is still really stacked against people who didn't already have access to the system. So it's a long way of saying there is a little bit of course correction, but I think we need to do a lot more, and every layer of gatekeeping needs to be much more active in recognizing your role in this system and how we are publishing more perspectives, more voices. And look, here's my thing, right? I'm a writer who believes in stories, and so I'm an editor who believes in stories. And here's the deal: the more diverse your cast of storytellers is, the more stories you get, and the better stories you get. The overall story of our food culture is a better and richer story. And you know, it's funny too, because I also feel like what I'm talking about is a very 101 level concept, and still, like, our industry, you know, it's very, very slow going in making a real correction in how we do things. And that's even before we get to work that I think we all recognize is really urgent right now, but not just how to sort of confront our implicit biases. It's like, oh, how do we actually do anti-racist work, right? You know, the distinction between, like, well, I'm not racist, and trying to figure out what that actually means, to, like, okay, how do I actually help destroy racism, which is another leap yet. So I feel like that's kind of where we need to be as a society, and I feel like I'm still talking about the 101 level of
But and we've certainly seen it. I mean, I remember when a woman was made the executive chef at a restaurant that I was very familiar with, and you know, this was an outstanding chef, but what she had to do to prove herself was entirely different from her immediate predecessor, who was a guy with lesser credentials, honestly. But you know, I'd like to think that the culinary industry has gotten better on that front, but we know that people of color have an entirely different experience, and there's so many obstacles, as you mentioned. So telling more stories from more perspectives is something that we all can do. What are some of the other things that we as bloggers should be thinking about? You know, we want to break through the barriers. We want to tell better stories. We want to tell authentic stories. And we don't want to play into the traps that, if we just do the easy stuff, will follow. So what would be some of your advice to get deeper in and get the real truth?
I don't know. I mean, I think it's because we're talking about it in such an abstract way. It's hard to I feel like it's hard to be really pointed and specific, and therefore probably useful in my advice. But I do think, okay, let me throw out a couple of things that may be platitudes, but you know, may also be helpful to people, because they're things that pop up in my head all the time, and that is to tell a deeper and better story. The first thing you have to do, I think, is you stop thinking of yourself as a writer, and you think of yourself as a listener. I think, you know, you said really kind words before about, you know, how I choose my words and things like that. But before I get to that place in my brain, I kind of feel like, or even like sort of more core to, I think, who I am as a writer, as an editor, as a professional in media. Before I get to my love of language, I have to start from, what am I hearing? And how do I ask questions? What are the kinds of questions I'm asking? How can I ask questions that will get us to a deeper place in conversation with someone? How do I demonstrate to the person I'm talking to, if it's an interview for a story or an interview for my radio show or whatever, how do I demonstrate to them that I'm listening to them? demonstrate to them that I am willing to be as vulnerable as I am asking them to be, so that they feel confidence and they feel security in talking with me. And I think that's where it has to start. It has to start with you being willing to be as vulnerable as the person you're talking to. It doesn't mean you should start that way. It doesn't mean you need to like make yourself the star of it and like, hey, before I start talking to you, let me tell you about my childhood trauma. Now you feel safe with me. Like, that's not really how it necessarily works. Like, you gotta have to feel out situation to situation. But what are the ways in which you can let the person, again, assuming your story involves you talking to another person at some point in the process, but how do you get people to, I don't always say get people to open up, because it feels like it's manipulative, and I don't think it's about manipulating them to tell you something. It's about recognizing that when they tell you their story, they are giving you a gift. They are giving you a piece of themselves that is possibly the core of who they are. And when someone has given you that, you need to hold that, and you need to feel the weight of it, and you need to feel the burden of it, right? You need to feel like, now I have to do right by you because you have given me this thing. That's where it comes from, for me anyway. Not everyone's method, not everyone's philosophy in the world. Plenty of great reporters, like, journalists, can get you to tell them whatever the hell they need to hear for their story and get out of there. Like, it's different ways to see the world, different ways to do what I'm talking about. But for me, that's
how important is it for us to probe and then report on where the food came from? And I mean, not so much the actual produce, but the heritage of the cuisine or the artistry that the chef that you're interviewing developed, that backstory stuff. Is that important, and how so?
I think it's important if you think it's important. Meaning, like, I think if that's what you want to get at, but there are also, like, there are a trillion ways to think of that, right? Are you approaching it like an historian, and do you want to dig back and see what is the first recorded example or description of this dish, and like, this dish was invented in this place by these people in this culture, so on and so forth. Like, that's a version of that has its own importance certainly in the process of finding those stories, like that. And this is why historians exist, right? They don't exist to like tell us stories about the past. They tell us stories about the past so we can illuminate how we got here, and for us to make meaning of why that matters. Or you can take it from a story, or you can approach it from a personal narrative. Well, how did you learn to make this, and why does it matter to you? Or in the case of a chef, well, what were your inspirations, or what were you thinking of when you came upon this dish? And do you want to dig in that story as a matter of artistry and craft? Like, okay, can you break down your creative process for me? Can you think about, well, this flavor goes with this flavor, and I know that because of this, and like, how did you put those together? And why exactly 3 pieces of this instead of 5? And versus, where have you been in the world? Who taught you to cook food? Like, how did you come to a place where this felt like an expression of your cooking? Like, but what I mean? Like, the backstory, it can be as varied as, only limited by, again, like the creativity of the questions you want to ask it. The question is it important? Again, I think you can interpret it lots of different ways. Is it important to whatever the project of the story is you're writing? Maybe, maybe not. I don't know what story you're writing. But is it important in terms of like the bigger overall culture that we live in? Is it important for us to be asking where our food comes from? And I think the answer has to be yes, right? The answer has to be yes. Whether in like the Portlandia, cliched way of like, oh, what was the chicken's name? Is the chicken local? Like, okay, that was a joke, and that's a joke we've been telling for 15 years now. But like, we all understand why people think that's important. Like, I don't need to go into that. But also like the question of like, okay, so lately there's been this conversation of food media about, and it's sort of interesting because I feel like there's, you know, the conversation about like, oh, what's cultural appropriation in food versus, and there are really smart ways to think about that and interrogate that idea, and there are, I think, less, I don't want to say less smart, but certainly less useful ways of interrogating that idea. I think the least useful way is who is allowed to cook this versus who's allowed to cook that. Because I think I understand why that conversation exists. I don't see where that gets us as a society moving forward. Whereas the question of how did you come to learn to cook this food, and how and what are you doing? Again, speaking more specifically of people who are in media who are going to be like broadcasting their cooking of this food, not like, you know, what you make at home for you and your family is between you and your family. I truly don't, you know, I don't think anyone should have, you know, much of an opinion about that. What is your intent? But but if we're thinking about, okay, where does this food come from and why is that an important conversation? Because it helps us get to a place where we should be able to acknowledge our influences. And if we acknowledge and credit our influences, that means we're starting, I emphasize starting, to do the work of sharing the spotlight and maybe sharing the cachet and maybe in some ways sharing the benefits that come from your work and your labor of knowing how to make this thing and teaching someone else how to do it or inspiring someone else how to do it. This is all very abstract. Let me bring up an example, for instance. And it's a little bit, I'm a little bit biased towards this person because he's an author of mine and a friend of mine, but there's a chef named Chris Shepard in Houston. And he sort of made his name. He had a restaurant called Underbelly. Now he has like a restaurant company called like Underbelly that has like different restaurants underneath that umbrella. Excuse me. And when I first heard of him, he's like a white dude from Nebraska. Pretty sure he's from Nebraska. And when he really started making his name in a national way, it was because he was making food that was like inspired, like very Vietnamese sounding, and then some food that was Mexican sounding, and some food that was Indian sounding. And I was like, really? Tell me more. Okay, dude. And then I'm pretty sure the moment that crystallized that he was doing something different was when I learned that when you go to his restaurant, okay, so the story in him was like, oh, when other like cool dude chefs or whatever go and train, they go and like stage, which is, you know, word for like an unpaid internship, but they go and stage like 3 Michelin star restaurants around the world or whatever. And what Chris did was he would go to stage in Thai grocery or a Vietnamese noodle shop or a Korean deli, and so on and so forth. And so he would like bring those techniques and flavors back to his restaurant. And I was like, okay, that's kind of cool, but there's a big but there. And then what I learned was you go to his restaurant and when you get the check, it comes a little, check presenter, and you open it up and in it there's a note and it says, thank you so much for coming to visit us. We would love for you to come back soon, but please, before you come back to us, go to one of these other places. These are the places that inspired us, and patronize them first. And the name of that Thai grocery and that Vietnamese deli, that Vietnamese noodle shop, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And when I talked to him, he's like, look, I've gotten a lot of great attention for what I do. I'm really thankful of that. I'm really proud of my team. I'm really proud of what I do. But like, I would not be here were it not for these people. So it's only right that I use whatever attention I get to help shine part of the spotlight on them. And it's so simple. It's so simple. And in my mind, I kind of feel like that gets us over the biggest hurdle of the conversation about cultural appropriation, right? Because the biggest hurdle is like, why are you profiting off of something that someone else gave you? And he's like, I want them to profit too. Like, like, I think that it's so simple what he's done. And yet, why does that feel so revolutionary? Why does that feel like that was so unique? Because then part of the deal is now we're talking about Chris Shepard and the great thing Chris Shepard does. And no, it shouldn't be about the great thing Chris Shepard does. That should just be normal. Anyway,
and
I'm
what
sure
you're
I'm like
describing
100
plays
miles
out.
away from the question, but
What you're describing plays out in every industry, though. Science is notorious for full professors taking credit for work that was done by students in some cases. It's kind of the same sort of thing where, if we as writers push a little harder and find out, okay, where did these ideas really come from? How did you develop this concept? Or, is this really your own style, or was it something that a grandmother or grandfather taught you somewhere?
Sure, yeah. And it's possible that we don't know, right? It's possible that we don't know. And I think this is when we get to sort of another layer of the conversation. So like, there's been, like there's a little bit of a tension that I think that the conversation has moved towards. It's one thing if you do know. So what I was just talking about was this, like, a case where, like, specifically this person was able to say, I learned to make this dish from from this family. And I've since taken the things they've taught me. Like, I don't think he makes a lot that's like, oh, they taught me this dish and now I make it. It's like, oh, they taught me these techniques and now I've used it. And like, I've made my own dishes with some of those flavors or some of those, techniques. But it comes specifically from my experience and the generosity of his family. So please go patronize them and taste their food and get it at the source as well. So like, that's great. And he knows the specifics of the people involved, right? But there is a bigger picture question of, I was in, so I'm, as you can see by the logs, I'm in something of a rural area. Went to the supermarket yesterday, and mask on and everything. It's great. Everyone had masks on. Wear a mask. It's not a conspiracy theory to take away your freedoms. It's just to keep other people from getting sick. Really easy. But anyway, I was in this grocery store and I went to, the always problematic international aisle because I needed some rice noodles and they actually have some, great. And they have fish sauce and they have, gochujang, and I was really glad to have that available to me in this pretty rural area. And at some point, there used to be, I was talking to my friend who grew up around here, who I'm staying with, and he was like, yeah, not that long ago where there was a big sign like ethnic food, and now it doesn't say that anymore. It's just an aisle where you find those things together. And it's sort of a microcosm of this bigger picture conversation of, well, when does a flavor or a tradition, because we are a country in large part of immigrants, not entirely of immigrants, because some of us didn't come here by choice and our ancestors didn't come here by choice, which is something that I was schooled on by the great Jessica Harris when I once said, we're all the either immigrants or children of immigrants. And she was like, not all of us, honey. But anyway, at what point does something that's particular to what we might today call an immigrant culture, like fish sauce, become seen as simply part of the mainstream? There was no sign by the pasta that said this is the Italian aisle. 10 years ago, there was a sign by the fish sauce that said the ethnic aisle. That sign has now been removed, but that's how people will still think of it, right? You go there because like the tortillas were right next to the fish sauce and so on and so forth. Because there's a bigger picture question of like, at what point does embracing what you might call the global pantry, or what I think of as an American pantry, because fish sauce is no more or less American than pasta is, or than, you know, whatever. But there's a tension there because some people think of it as an erasure. I don't want my culture to just be folded in to be American culture. It's still my culture. And frankly, it's a culture I've had to deal with being made fun of for my entire life. And now all of a sudden it's cool. So like, oh, it's like, now it's American. Well, fuck you. Sorry, pardon my language. I don't know if this is like there's a language restriction on our professionalism right now, but like, you know what I mean? Like, so I understand that's a real cultural debate, and it's a very valid debate. And I don't know what the right answer is. I think both sides are the right answer, right? I think in a way, there, you know, I remember being taught in middle school. It's like, oh, people used to talk about America as a melting pot, but really we should think about more of as a salad, where like it's a lot of things that come together. They're still individual, you know, they still have their own character, but they're not all molten together. But you can appreciate the thing as a whole. And anyway, so I think I'm sort of straying from the question, but I think that's a really, I think I don't know there's a right answer, and I don't know that we'll get somewhere, but that's something I think we have to keep talking about, because in talking about what we do is we start to keep reifying our identities and interrogating our identities and interrogating the society we exist in. We always kind of have to ask ourselves, because that's the point. That's the point of a society that's like polyglot, right? Like, you have to figure out how we exist with one another and make one another better while not losing ourselves.
Some of our commenters are suggesting that, you know, there ought to be, or maybe we already are part of a movement to break down racism, break down discrimination through food stories.
Yeah, although I would caution that the minute you think, oh, I'm part of the movement to break it down, you're already stubbing your toe, because that means you're feeling good about where you are. And I think the hard work of anti-racism is you can never feel good about where you are, because guess what? Like, I'm a person of color. I'm proud of my identity. I'm proud of who I am. And I know racism lives inside me. I know it. I was raised in a racist society. I was raised, you know, some of it is self-directed. There are ways in which I hate my own race. There are ways in which, there are ways in which I am, there, like, all this stuff is like really tied down deep in your DNA when you grow up in a society that has taught you the messages that our society has taught us. And we have to always be asking ourselves, like, wait, what is it? Like, last night I was having a conversation with my wife, and I was like, yeah, but, and she's like, the very fact that you're saying, yeah, but, maybe you're right, maybe you're wrong. But anytime you say, yeah, but, you need to stop and you need to think about, where does this yeah, but come from? Sorry, this is just a little.
Well, what I'm hearing from you, I think, is such an important lesson. And it goes back to what you said earlier, that to be better writers and storytellers, and this is probably true in food and every field, we have to be better listeners.
For sure.
So it's not about us or the story that we necessarily want to be telling. It's about the story that needs to be told. And it's the story that maybe others aren't pushing hard enough to find.
Yeah.
You work in multiple media, and we're going to go to the top of the hour, if that's okay. I want to make sure we get to the questions, which everybody's submitted, which is great. Between the television, magazines, and other print and radio, which is your favorite form of media and why?
I don't know if I have a favorite one. And I think, they're all different ways of telling different stories. So I appreciate them all, right? Again, at the end of the day, I think of myself as a storyteller who really, has his core as someone who loves hearing stories or being gifted people's stories. So I don't know that I have a favorite. Writing is probably the hardest work of those, and being like somewhere where the camera trained on you is probably like the most like emotionally stressful. But
speaking of camera trained on you, we had a couple of people who wanted to know, where are you sheltering in place? You don't need to share more than you want.
It's an undisclosed location, but I have to confess that because there were some health issues in my family right before COVID really hit, we felt like we kind of could not stay at home in New York.
I think many people would do the same if they had the opportunity and need to. So anyway, I hope you and your family are safe. Of all the things you've done,
I'm sorry.
Of all the things you've done, what's your favorite?
I don't know. Have a kid? Like, like I don't know. Marry my wife.
Is there a favorite story or an interview or some experience that sticks out as greatest moment or most memorable, or something that others should try to have a similar experience doing?
You know what I would say is this. Like when you say that, like, oh, I think of like particular stories I've written that I'm proud of, and I think of certain things like that. But the thing that really rings true to me is, it's sort of funny. Okay, so being an editor is really different than being a writer, and there are different skills, and not every editor is a writer, and not every writer is meant to be an editor. I happen to like doing both things and have some experience doing both things. But the thing that's really freaking great about being an editor, and particularly a book editor, is you can work in service of the book, of the story, to the author. And what that means is, when the book is out in the world, or that article or whatever is out in the world, you don't own it. So you can just be a fan of it. And when it comes to just feeling exhilarating joy, there was no feeling like seeing my authors that I've worked with go up there and grab their James Beard Award. It's just heart-burstingly amazing. So I highly recommend that. If you can edit an author who goes and wins the James Beard Award, go do it, because it's the greatest freaking feeling.
I can imagine what that must be like. One of the questions we got is on the boundary between appropriating a recipe or appropriating somebody's cultural background and honoring it appropriately. So what are some of the sort of best practices if you're writing about a chicken wing recipe, for example? I mean, that's something where lots of different cultures have lots of different ways to make it. How do you write a recipe like that where you're drawing on flavors from different places in an appropriate way?
It's a really big question. I don't know that I have like the checklist. I mean, it's really about how. I would say this. I'm seeing some of the comments on the right. It's like, and people pointing out like, Asian chicken wings. What the hell does that mean? European pork? Like, show me your recipe for European pork. So I think the first thing to do is have the respect to gain some level of knowledge of the specificity of what you're doing, to even be able to talk about it in an appropriate way. Yes, there are things that many Asian cultures share, and so like, that makes a certain sense. But if you just like reflexively reach for Asian because you don't actually know the origins of what you're doing, then maybe you can educate yourself a little bit on it. At the same time, like, part of it is, I don't know, and drilling down deeper can be a process of, again, demonstrating the respect you have to educate yourself. I'm not saying if you have European pork, I don't know, it doesn't mean that the work is complete. Even if just because you can name a geographic area better than continent, isn't necessarily the thing you've checked off the box. I think so. What I think it comes down to is, what is the thing that motivates your work? And is the core view that motivates your work, is there a big part of it that says, for me to do this project, I need to be listening and learning and giving credit where appropriate? Is that built into your creative process? Because if it's not, then I think it's gonna be really hard. It's gonna be really hard to travel in a world that seems like, that in the murky, culturally appropriative or not world, and if you don't have that sort of safeguard built in to your process, then I think you're gonna have a tough time of it. Like, you need to be asking yourself, inquiring within yourself, and yourself, like, am I giving respect where due?
Well, and I think you're also pointing to the fact that not everybody puts enough effort into their reporting as they're developing a recipe or writing about a cuisine to understand that, and this is true in every region. One of the commenters points out that Jamaican food is Caribbean food, but not all Caribbean food is Jamaican, right, and vice versa. And even in Jamaica, if you have food in Montego Bay, it's going to be different from Port Antonio.
Sure. Yeah.
But if you've never actually asked questions or been to those places, it's harder to tell. And that's absolutely true in the United States. Virginia, from one side of Virginia, coastal Virginia to inland Virginia,
Tidewater and the Piedmont
it's entirely different. And I think as food writers, the more conscious we are of those differences is probably the way that we can bring people closer together overall, I hope.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to say the other side of it too, which is like, you're gonna make mistakes, and like, we should allow people the room to make mistakes if we recognize through the body of their other work or through the way they talk about their work that they're like, we're all trying. Because I said before, there is no right answer. Is fish sauce American in the mainstream? Can we consider it American, or can we consider it Vietnamese or Thai? And the answer is yes to both, right? But when in a world in which the answer is yes to both, that means you're going to have different opinions and different perspectives on it, and people are going to feel strongly about one or the other. And that means we have to have a larger body of work and a larger sort of perspective we come from to be like, hey, this is what I'm trying to do here, and we're all going to muddle our way through, and we're all going to die before this conversation is over, right? Like, that's the thing. We're all going to die before this conversation is over. So let's try to have this conversation as well as we can, with as great a level of respect and intentionality as we can, and hope that our children, when they pick up the baton, are in a different place when they're having this conversation. Because that's also part of it. Like, in the way that like anti-racism work is never done, like the project of defining ourselves as Americans is never done. That's kind of the point of our country. That's what it's supposed to be anyway. That's what it prided itself on. And we're seeing all the ways in which we have failed as a society in doing that. And what animates us, or me anyway, is, but that was the idea. We're still trying to get to that idea. We're a million miles away from it, but we have to hold on to the idea.
I don't think we could come to a better, more logical conclusion. And I appreciate the comment that just came in. Can we continue for another hour? Because this is so important. And I agree with that, but I know that everybody's got other plans. But thank you so much.
No, thank you for having me.
You're inspiring because of both your success, but also your wisdom and clarity of where we need to keep doing better. And that's something which I hope influences us all. And thank you all for participating. Thank you for the questions. I hope we got to most of the questions. I think we did. Thank you for participating in the IFBC.
Can I add one more thing really quickly?
Absolutely.
So because the audience, if you are thinking of a cookbook, or you want to work on, you're working towards a cookbook or towards a proposal, particularly if you are a person of color, my email is flam@prh.com. I have to say that I would love to be able to help you, even if not, be able to publish you. I mean, there's a whole mess of things that happen there, but get to me. And I have to say, like, I also have to temper, like, yeah, I would love to be that guy who's like, yes, and then he wrote everyone back, like, and we had hours-long conversation. Like, I don't know what my bandwidth is, to be completely honest. But if you can help me help you, I would love to be able to do it. Give me clear explanations of your project and what you want to do, and what your motivations are. And yeah, get to me. flam@prh.com.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. This was a fantastic session, super inspiring. Thank you both. Francis, I really agree. I think everyone has a pearl, and it's our job to figure out what that is. And that's for everyone, and the grocery store on the side of the street. So I will do a better job asking people, learning. Thank you for having this conversation, and I hope we can all continue it every day. Talk to Francis, talk on social media. So thank you very much. If you did come in later or want to replay the session, it is available through our All Access Pass. I did send a link in the chat right now, so please click on that before it goes away. Thank you all for coming. We do have another session in an hour, so please join us for that. We have 3 more for the rest of the day, one starting at 9, another starting at 11 about doing a remote photo shoot, and then one starting at 1 p.m. Pacific time about 3 ways to win on Instagram. So please join us then. Thank you again all for joining, and I hope to talk to you all later. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.